The altimeter needle quivered at 22,000 feet as Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai watched the impossible unfold beneath his wings. The blue-gray American fighter was climbing toward him, its Pratt and Whitney engine roaring defiance against every law of aerial combat he had mastered. For 3 years, no enemy aircraft had dared follow a Zero into the vertical realm where Japanese pilots ruled absolute. But this Grumman Hellcat was rewriting those equations in real time, ascending at angles that should have been impossible for any American machine. December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m., Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya banked his Mitsubishi A6M Zero into a diving turn, watching American Curtiss P-40 Warhawk scramble from Wheeler Field below. The Hawaiian morning sun glinted off his canopy as he lined up behind a climbing Warhawk, noting how the heavier American fighter struggled to gain altitude. At 150 knots, Itaya's Zero climbed effortlessly at 3,000 feet per minute, while the P-40 managed barely 2,000. The mathematical advantage was overwhelming. The Zero weighed just 5,563 pounds, fully loaded, giving it a power-to-weight ratio that no American fighter could match. Its Nakajima Sakai 14-cylinder radial engine produced 1,130 horsepower. But more importantly, every component had been designed for absolute minimum weight. The airframe used aluminum as thin as aluminum foil. Fuel tanks lacked self-sealing protection. Armor plating was non-existent. These design choices created an aircraft that could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outlast any fighter in the world. Itaya squeezed his trigger, watching 20mm cannon shells tear into the Warhawk's wing root. The American fighter rolled over and plummeted toward the harbor, trailing black smoke. Through his radio, Itaya heard similar reports from across the attack formation. American fighters were falling like leaves, unable to compete in the vertical realm where Japanese pilots had spent years perfecting their craft. The tactical doctrine was elegant in its simplicity. When engaged by heavier American fighters, Zero pilots would immediately climb. American aircraft optimized for speed and firepower couldn't follow. Once at altitude, Japanese pilots could choose when and how to engage, diving on American formations with impunity before climbing back to safety. The vertical dimension belonged entirely to Japan. Flight Petty Officer, First Class Saburo Sakai, had perfected this technique during his tour in China, where he had shot down Chinese aircraft that tried desperately to match the Zero's climb rate. By Pearl Harbor, Sakai had accumulated 28 confirmed victories, each one a testament to Japanese technological superiority. The Zero wasn't just an aircraft. It was a philosophy of aerial combat that prioritized agility over protection, climb rate over top speed. American pilots quickly learned to fear the distinctive elliptical wings and greenhouse canopy of approaching Zeros. In the Philippines, Captain Colin Kelly's B-17 Flying Fortress fell to 0 attacks after the heavy bomber's gunners proved unable to track the highly maneuverable Japanese fighters. At Wake Island, Marine F-4F Wildcats fought valiantly, but were systematically destroyed by Zero formations that could climb above them and attack from superior positions. By mid-1942, Zero pilots had achieved something unprecedented in aviation history: complete air superiority based purely on aircraft performance. Over Java, Sumatra, and the Central Pacific, Japanese fighters operated with impunity. American bomber formations required massive fighter escorts, yet still suffered catastrophic losses when Zero formations intercepted them. The technical specifications told the story in precise numbers. The Zero's wing loading of 24 pounds per square foot was the lowest of any fighter in service. Its turn radius at 15,000 feet measured just 650 feet, half that of contemporary American fighters. Most critically, its initial climb rate of 4,500 feet per minute at sea level exceeded every Allied fighter except the British Spitfire, which wasn't available in Pacific operations. What these confident pilots couldn't foresee was that American industry was already analyzing captured Zero components, measuring performance characteristics, and designing countermeasures. The technological superiority they took for granted was about to face the greatest industrial challenge in aviation history. July 10, 1942, Dutch Harbor, Alaska. Lieutenant William Thies climbed through the twisted wreckage of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero that had crash-landed on Akutan Island 3 weeks earlier. The aircraft was remarkably intact, its pilot having died on impact but leaving behind the most valuable intelligence prize of the Pacific War. Within hours, the Zero was crated and shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, where American engineers would finally understand what made Japanese fighters so deadly. The Akutan Zero arrived at North Island on July 15 under extraordinary security. Teams from Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics immediately began the most comprehensive analysis of enemy aircraft in American history. Every rivet, every wire, every component was measured, weighed, and tested. What they discovered challenged every assumption about aircraft design. Roy Grumman, founder of Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, studied the test reports with growing understanding. His company had been struggling to match Zero performance with the F4F Wildcat, which was outclassed in every category except diving speed and structural durability. The Wildcat weighed nearly 8,000 pounds, compared to the Zero's 5,563 pounds, explaining why Japanese fighters could outclimb and outmaneuver American aircraft. But Grumman recognized that American industry possessed advantages the Japanese lacked. While Japan had achieved remarkable efficiency through extreme weight reduction, American manufacturing could produce more powerful engines and sophisticated systems that Japanese factories couldn't match. The solution wasn't to copy the Zero, but to exceed its performance through superior engineering and industrial capacity. The F6F Hellcat development program began in earnest on August 1, 1942. Grumman's design team established performance requirements that would eliminate every Zero advantage. The new fighter would climb faster than a Zero above 15,000 feet, where most Pacific combat occurred. It would outgun the Zero with 6 50-caliber machine guns, compared to the Zero's 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns. The heart of the Hellcat was the Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, compared to the Zero's 1,130 horsepower. This massive 18-cylinder radial engine weighed over 2,500 pounds, more than half a Zero's empty weight, but it provided the power necessary to overcome the Hellcat's increased mass while maintaining superior performance. American metallurgy and manufacturing techniques allowed the Hellcat to incorporate features impossible for Japanese industry. The fuel tanks included self-sealing liners that could absorb bullet impacts without leaking. Pilot armor protection consisted of steel plating behind the seat and bulletproof glass in the windscreen. These additions increased weight, but provided survivability that Zero pilots could never achieve. The development timeline reflected American industrial advantages, where Japanese aircraft development required years of hand-fitting and custom manufacturing. American assembly line techniques allowed rapid prototyping and testing. The first XF6F1 prototype flew on June 26, 1942, just 6 weeks after the Akutan Zero analysis began. American pilot training programs expanded dramatically to support the new fighter. The Navy established training bases across the southern United States, where thousands of student pilots learned to fly high-performance fighters. Unlike Japanese training, which emphasized individual skill development over years of instruction, American programs focused on standardized procedures that could prepare competent pilots in months rather than years. By December 1942, production Hellcats were rolling off assembly lines at Bethpage, Long Island. Each aircraft incorporated lessons learned from Zero analysis, while exceeding Japanese performance through superior American engineering. The power-to-weight ratio that had given Zeros their climbing advantage was matched by the Hellcat's massive engine. November 11, 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. Flight Petty Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa adjusted his oxygen mask as he climbed his Zero toward 25,000 feet, pursuing what appeared to be a standard American fighter formation. Through his canopy, he could see the distinctive inverted gull wings of Vought F-4U Corsairs below, but something was different about their climb rate. These American fighters were ascending at angles that seemed impossible for the heavy machines he had fought throughout 1943. At 18,000 feet, Nishizawa expected the Corsairs to level off and attempt diving attacks, the standard American tactic for avoiding vertical engagements with Zeros. Instead, the lead Corsair continued climbing, its Pratt and Whitney R2-800 engine maintaining power output that should have been unsustainable at altitude. Nishizawa pulled his Zero into a steeper climb, confident in his aircraft's superior power-to-weight ratio, but the gap between him and the American fighter remained constant. For the first time in 2 years of combat, Nishizawa found himself unable to outclimb an American fighter. His Zero, which had dominated every vertical engagement since Pearl Harbor, was being matched by an enemy aircraft that violated every tactical assumption Japanese pilots had developed. The mathematical certainty of Zero superiority was being challenged by American engineering that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The combat reports reaching Japanese headquarters painted a disturbing picture of American technological advancement. Veteran pilots consistently described encounters with enemy fighters that could climb with Zeros, engage in sustained turning fights, and absorb battle damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft. The reports were so contrary to established intelligence assessments that many were dismissed as pilot error or misidentification. Japanese tactical doctrine had been built entirely around technological superiority. Standard procedures called for immediate climbs when engaged by American fighters, using altitude advantage to control engagement terms. When American aircraft began matching Zero climb rates, Japanese pilots found themselves without effective tactical responses. The vertical dimension that had belonged exclusively to Japan was becoming contested airspace. By December 1943, pattern analysis of combat reports revealed systematic changes in American fighter performance across the Pacific theater. Aircraft identified as F-4F Wildcats were demonstrating climb rates exceeding documented specifications. The technological assumptions underlying Japanese air superiority were crumbling under the weight of accumulated combat experience. What Japanese pilots were discovering, without understanding the full implications, was that American industrial capacity had finally achieved technological parity. The Hellcats they were encountering represented the culmination of 18 months of intensive development based on captured Zero analysis. The mathematical certainty of Japanese air superiority was being replaced by American engineering superiority that would soon prove overwhelming. June 19, 1944, 7:32 a.m. Philippine Sea, 150 miles northwest of Guam. Flight Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai pressed his throttle forward as his formation of 16 Zeros climbed toward the reported American carrier task force. At 15,000 feet, he spotted the enemy fighters rising to meet them, their distinctive inverted gull wings, identifying them as the improved American aircraft that had been causing problems throughout the Central Pacific. What Sakai couldn't know was that he was leading his formation into the largest carrier battle in naval history, where 430 Japanese aircraft would face 956 American fighters and bombers. More critically, he was about to discover that the blue-gray fighters climbing toward him were F6F Hellcats, specifically designed to eliminate every advantage his Zero had maintained for 30 months of war. At 18,000 feet, Sakai expected the American formation to level off and attempt diving attacks. Instead, the Hellcats continued climbing at rates that matched his Zero's performance. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, leading a division of Hellcats from Fighting Squadron 16, had been briefed on Zero tactics and was deliberately engaging in the vertical fight that Japanese pilots considered their exclusive domain. The mathematical reality that Sakai discovered was devastating. Above 15,000 feet, the Hellcat's massive R2-800 double Wasp engine maintained power output that exceeded the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. While the Zero had superior climb rate at sea level, the Hellcat's turbo-supercharged engine provided better performance at the altitudes where most Pacific combat occurred. The engagement that followed shattered 3 years of tactical assumptions. Vrasiu's Hellcat could not only match the Zero's climb rate, but could absorb battle damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft. When Sakai's 20mm cannon shells struck the Hellcat's engine cowling, the aircraft continued fighting rather than falling away in flames. The self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection that Japanese designers had sacrificed for weight savings proved decisive in sustained combat. Across the Philippine Sea, similar encounters were destroying Japanese formations at unprecedented rates. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from the USS Essex, reported American fighters engaging Japanese aircraft in climbing fights and winning through superior firepower and protection. The 650 caliber machine guns mounted in each Hellcat provided concentrated firepower that could destroy Zeros with brief bursts, while Japanese pilots found their lighter armament insufficient against American aircraft built to absorb punishment. The tactical revolution was complete. Japanese pilots who had dominated aerial combat through superior climb performance found themselves outclimbed, outgunned, and overwhelmed by American fighters that violated every assumption about enemy capabilities. The psychological shock extended beyond individual encounters to the fundamental beliefs that had sustained Japanese naval aviation. By noon, Japanese strike formations that had launched with confidence in their aircraft superiority were being decimated by Hellcat squadrons that could engage them in any flight regime. The vertical sanctuary where Japanese pilots had always found safety was no longer exclusive territory. American fighters were climbing to 25,000 feet and engaging Japanese formations with tactical advantages that had previously belonged only to Zeros. The loss rates told the story in devastating statistics. Of the 430 Japanese aircraft launched that morning, only 35 returned to their carriers. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, most to anti-aircraft fire rather than air-to-air combat. The mathematical exchange rate that had favored Japanese pilots since Pearl Harbor had reversed completely through American technological advancement. What made the defeat particularly devastating was the realization that American fighters were being flown by relatively inexperienced pilots who were nevertheless achieving victory through technological superiority. The years of intensive training that created elite Japanese aviators were being negated by American aircraft design that allowed average pilots to defeat veterans through superior equipment rather than superior skill. July 15, 1944. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Bethpage, Long Island. The assembly line hummed with mechanical precision as workers completed another F6F Hellcat every 15 minutes. Shift supervisor Robert Morrison watched the finished fighter roll out of the factory, the 547th Hellcat, completed that month. What Morrison couldn't know was that this single aircraft represented more production capacity than Japan's entire aviation industry could achieve in the same time frame. The mathematical reality was staggering. Grumman's Long Island facility alone was producing more Hellcats monthly than Japan's combined factories could manufacture Zeros. By July 1944, American production lines had completed over 8,000 Hellcats, While Japan struggled to maintain zero production above 200 aircraft per month, the industrial disparity that had always existed between the two nations was finally being applied to creating superior weapons rather than simply more weapons. The human mathematics were equally devastating. Japan had entered the war with approximately 3,500 experienced naval aviators, representing the finest pilot training program in the world. Each Japanese pilot required 3 years of intensive instruction before achieving combat proficiency. By mid-1944, over 70% of these irreplaceable veterans had been killed in action, creating a training crisis that Japanese aviation could never resolve. American pilot training philosophy differed fundamentally from Japanese methods, where Japan emphasized individual excellence through years of instruction. American programs focused on standardized procedures that could prepare competent pilots in 8 months. The result was a production line approach to pilot development that could replace losses at rates that Japanese training infrastructure could never match. The quality versus quantity debate that had sustained Japanese morale was being resolved through American achievement of both quality and quantity superiority. The Hellcat represented not just technical advancement, but industrial capacity that could mass-produce superior weapons, while Japan struggled to maintain existing production levels. Democratic capitalism was demonstrating advantages that totalitarian systems couldn't match. What Japanese pilots never learned was the full extent of American industrial mobilization. Beyond the 12,475 Hellcats that would be produced by war's end, American factories were simultaneously manufacturing thousands of other fighter types, bombers, and transport aircraft. The industrial capacity that Japan had dismissed as quantity without quality was producing weapons that exceeded Japanese designs, while maintaining production rates that Japanese industry had never achieved. October 25, 1944. Mabalacat Airfield, Luzon, Philippines. Flight Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai walked slowly toward his Zero, knowing this would be his final conventional combat mission. The aircraft that had once represented technological superiority now seemed fragile and obsolescent, beside intelligence photographs of American Hellcat formations. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had arrived at Mabalacat 3 days earlier with orders that would transform Japanese naval aviation from a fighting force into a weapon of desperation. Conventional air combat, he explained to assembled pilots, could no longer achieve meaningful results against American technological and numerical superiority. The mathematics were inescapable. Japanese pilots flying inferior aircraft against overwhelming enemy forces achieved exchange rates that accelerated Japanese defeat rather than delaying it. The solution, Onishi announced, was the Special Attack Corps. Individual aircraft would be loaded with explosives and flown directly into American warships, guaranteeing the destruction of at least one enemy vessel per pilot. The tactical logic was compelling in its simplicity. Since Japanese fighters could no longer compete with American aircraft in aerial combat, they would be transformed into guided missiles that American fighters couldn't intercept before impact. The tactical manual that had governed Japanese aerial combat since Pearl Harbor was replaced with briefings on ship identification and approach angles for suicide attacks. Pilots who had spent years mastering climbing spirals and deflection shooting learned instead how to penetrate anti-aircraft fire and identify the most vulnerable points on American warships. The art of aerial combat was being reduced to the science of terminal ballistics. The decision to abandon conventional fighter operations represented acknowledgement that American industrial capacity had achieved decisive superiority. Japanese commanders recognized that continued aerial combat would exhaust remaining pilot resources without meaningful impact on American operations. Kamikaze attacks offered the possibility of achieving tactical success through strategic desperation, trading pilot lives for guaranteed enemy losses. The aircraft that had once climbed confidently toward American formations were now being modified for single-direction flights toward American fleet formations. Zeros that had outclimbed American fighters for 3 years were being loaded with explosives that made climbing performance irrelevant. The technological competition that had driven aircraft development since Pearl Harbor ended with Japanese acceptance that superior American engineering had eliminated all conventional tactical options. By November 1944, Japanese naval aviation had completed its transformation from elite fighting force to kamikaze weapon system. The pilots who had entered the war supremely confident in their aircraft superiority were ending it by flying those same aircraft into American ships in missions that guaranteed death but offered minimal strategic impact. The altimeter needle that had trembled at 22,000 feet in Flight Petty Officer Sakai's cockpit represented more than mechanical failure. It symbolized the end of an era when technological superiority could compensate for industrial inadequacy. The Hellcat's ability to outclimb Zeros above 15,000 feet demonstrated a fundamental truth that would reshape modern warfare. Democratic industrial capacity, when focused and determined, could produce weapons that exceeded anything totalitarian systems achieved through desperation and individual excellence. Japanese pilots who had entered the war, confident in their aircraft superiority, discovered that technological advantage was temporary, but American manufacturing capacity was sustainable. The climb rate that had lifted Zeros above American fighters for 3 years became irrelevant when American factories could produce superior aircraft faster than Japan could train pilots to fly existing ones. Industrial democracy had proven that quantity and quality were not mutually exclusive when supported by engineering excellence and unlimited resources.